Hello, welcome to Outside the Boxes. I'm your host, Jocko Bear. Please follow, like, subscribe. Today I'm going to be getting into inflation. And I had a recent conversation with a friend, and he gave me this video. I believe I watched it about 15 years ago, but I don't remember much. Anyway, when it comes to inflation, what I was telling him was it's basically when we borrow a bunch of money from the Fed, that money is created out of thin air and has no value, so it steals its value from the existing money, making our existing dollars worth less and less because there's so much more of them. Put it simply, also the Federal Reserve Bank is not part of the government. It's a private bank owned and ran by five large banks, and the people who own and run them five banks that own and run the Federal Reserve also own the five largest oil companies. So I don't know. My friend told me that this is really informative. Gets into the modern monetary theory, and shows us the scam that's been pulled on us for over a century. So let's jump in.
Society today is composed of a series of institutions. From political institutions, legal institutions, religious institutions, to institutions of social class, familial values, and occupational specialization, it is obvious the profound influence these traditionalized structures have in shaping our understandings and perspectives. Yet, of all the social institutions we are born into, directed by, and conditioned upon, there seems to be no system as taken for granted and misunderstood as the monetary system. Taking on nearly religious proportions, the established monetary institution exists as one of the most unquestioned forms of faith there is.
Yeah, this is going to be good. There's a reason that most of us are confused about our money system. That is intentional. And there's a reason why most people don't understand inflation. That's intentional. It's our government and our media intentionally disinforming us and misinforming us so we don't understand the simple truth of what's going on. And isn't it funny that that same government doing that to us is talking to us about misinformation and disinformation that the people are putting out? Yeah, seems like bullshit. All right, let's get back into it.
How money is created, the policies by which it is governed, and how it truly affects society are unregistered interests of the great majority of the population. In a world where 1% of the population owns 40% of the planet's wealth, in a world where 34,000 children die every single day from poverty and preventable diseases, and where 50% of the world's population lives on less than $2 a day, one thing is clear: something is very wrong. And whether we are aware of...
Okay, I just gotta stop it right there for a sec. So when you said the majority of the world lives on $2 a day, I find that really interesting because in America, a lot of people talk and blame the one percenters in America for a lot of the problems, and the elite and the one percenters. But if you go and look at the one percenters on a world scale, almost all Americans are in the top 1% of the world. I mean, I think it's like 20 grand a year. If you make that, you're in the top 1% of the world. So if we hear bitch about the one percenters, is the rest of the world bitching about basically our whole country? Because we're the one percenters? I don't know. It's just something interesting. All right, back to it.
That are not the lifeblood of all of our established institutions, and thus society itself, is money. Therefore, understanding this institution of monetary policy is critical to understanding why our lives are the way they are. Unfortunately, economics is often viewed with confusion and boredom. Endless streams of financial jargon, coupled with intimidating mathematics, quickly deters people from attempts at understanding it.
Yeah, it's like what I was saying.
The fact is, the complexity associated with the financial system is a mere mask, designed to conceal one of the most socially paralyzing structures humanity has ever endured.
Well, this guy's speaking truth. Ugh. All right, let's see what you got for us. Let's learn some shit. None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe? I don't know who that is.
A number of years ago,
But
the
that's a
Central
damn
Bank of the
good
United
quote.
States, the Federal Reserve, produced a document entitled Modern Money Mechanics. This publication detailed the institutionalized practice of money creation as utilized by the Federal Reserve and the web of global commercial banks it supports. On the opening page, the document states its objective. The purpose of this booklet is to describe the basic process of money creation in a fractional reserve banking system. It then proceeds to describe this fractional reserve process through various banking terminology, a translation of which goes something like this. The United States government decides it needs some money, so it calls up the Federal Reserve and requests, say, $10 billion. The Fed replies, saying, sure, we'll buy $10 billion in government bonds from you. So the government takes some pieces of paper, paints some official-looking designs on them, and calls them treasury bonds. Then it puts a value on these bonds to the sum of $10 billion and sends them over to the Fed. In turn, the people at the Fed draw up a bunch of impressive pieces of paper themselves, only this time calling them Federal Reserve notes, also designating a value of $10 billion to the set. The Fed then takes these notes and trades them for the bonds. Once this exchange is complete, the government then takes the $10 billion in Federal Reserve notes and deposits it into a bank account. And upon this deposit, the paper notes officially become legal tender money, adding $10 billion to the U.S. money supply. And there it is. $10 billion in new money has been created. Of course, this example is a generalization, for, in reality, this transaction would occur electronically, with no paper used at all. In fact, only 3% of the U.S. money supply exists in physical currency. The other 97% essentially exists in computers alone. Now, government bonds are, by design, instruments of debt, and when the Fed purchases these bonds, with money it essentially created out of thin air, the government is actually promising to pay back that money to the Fed. In other words, the money was created out of debt. This mind-numbing paradox of how money or value can be created out of debt or a liability will become more clear as we further this exercise. So, the exchange has been made and now $10 billion sits in a commercial bank account. Here's where it gets really interesting. For as based on the fractional reserve practice, that $10 billion deposit instantly becomes part of the bank's reserves, just as all deposits do. And regarding reserve requirements, as stated in Modern Money Mechanics, a bank must maintain legally required reserves equal to a prescribed percentage of its deposits. It then quantifies this by stating, under current regulations, the reserve requirement against most transaction accounts is 10%. This means that with a $10 billion deposit, 10% or $1 billion is held as the required reserve, while the other $9 billion is considered an excessive reserve and can be used as the basis for new loans. Now, it is logical to assume that this $9 billion is literally coming out of the existing $10 billion deposit. However, this is actually not the case. What really happens is that the $9 billion is simply created out of thin air on top of the existing $10 billion deposit. This is how the money supply is expanded. As stated in Modern Money Mechanics, of course they, the banks, do not really pay out loans from the money they receive as deposits. If they did this, no additional money would be created. What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes, loan contracts, in exchange for credits, money, to the borrower's transaction accounts. In other words, the $9 billion can be created out of nothing simply because there is a demand for such a loan and that there is a $10 billion deposit to satisfy the reserve requirements. Now, let's assume that somebody walks into this bank and borrows the newly available $9 billion. They will then most likely take that money and deposit it into their own bank account. The process then repeats, for that deposit becomes part of the bank's reserves. 10% is isolated, and in turn 90% of the $9 billion, or $8.1 billion, is now available as newly created money for more loans. And of course, that 8.1 can be loaned out and redeposited, creating an additional 7.2 billion to 6.5 billion to 5.9 billion, etc. This
Holy shit, man. I don't know if you've been able to follow that last little bit, but Jesus Christ. I mean, I knew they made money out of thin air, but I thought mostly it was our government borrowing it from the Federal Reserve and sending our little bonds over, like IOUs. And we never pay our debt. We just pay the interest to the Federal Reserve because we can't afford. And that's why our debt is like 35 trillion. Because we keep borrowing it from them, which is interesting. They make it out of thin air. So what gives them the right to do that? And why can't we do that? Just make money out of thin air and loan it to our government at interest. And the whole government giving them bonds, IOUs that we never pay, and they just keep giving us whatever amount of money we want. Kind of reminds me of Dumb and Dumber. You remember the whole suitcase full of IOUs? I mean, that's kind of like what our government does with the Federal Reserve. We just send them over a suitcase full of bonds, which are like IOUs that we're never going to pay. So, yeah, this is pretty fucked up. I'm really glad this guy broke this down like this, kind of in layman's terms, so simple person can understand and start to learn what's really going on here. All right, let's get back to it.
deposit money creation loan cycle can technically go on to infinity. The
Of
average
course.
mathematical result is that about $90 billion can be created on top of the original $10 billion. In other
Jesus
words,
Christ.
for every deposit that ever occurs in the banking system, about 9 times that amount can be created out of thin air.
Money jitters. Ask the obliging Bank of America for a jar of soothing instant money, MONEY, in the form of a convenient personal loan.
So, now that we
Yeah, of
understand
course.
how money is created by this fractional reserve banking system, a logical yet elusive question might come to mind. What is actually giving this newly created money value?
Yeah.
The answer? The money that already exists.
Ah, exactly.
The new money essentially
Steals it.
steals value from the existing money supply. For the total pool of
Causing
money
inflation.
is being increased irrespective to demand for goods and services. And as supply and demand finds equilibrium, prices rise, diminishing the purchasing power of each individual dollar.
All by
This is generally
design.
referred to as inflation, and inflation is essentially a hidden tax on the public.
No shit.
What is the advice that you generally get? And that
Yeah,
is
it's
inflate
intentional.
the currency. They don't say debase the currency. They don't say devalue the currency.
All right, this is fucking Ron Paul. Now, I don't trust any goddamn fucking politician. They are not trustworthy. They're lying, deceiving fucking bastards. They're out for corporate interests and their own interests and not for the people's interests, which is what their fucking job is supposed to be. But once in a while, you see guys like this. They sound like they were trying to represent the people and the people's interest. Mr. Ron Paul here, I believe, was the first one in many, many, many decades to propose legislation to abolish the Federal Reserve Bank. And most recently, I heard this guy, politician Thomas Maine,